Good evening and welcome. I think most people have managed to join us from the waiting area now. Welcome. This is the third in our series of webinars that we've been putting on over the last few months. My name's Lee. I'm the CEO at OCD Action, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our webinar this evening. This evening's webinar is particularly focused on understanding the recommended treatment for OCD. So if that wasn't what you were expecting, if you're expecting to log on for your yoga or HIIT class or something, maybe log off now and look for the right link. But this evening's webinar does promise to be really interesting and exciting. We're really grateful to our three speakers this evening, Dr. Victoria Hallett and Dr. Stuart Browning from the Specialist OCD Clinic, and Ria, who is really well known to OCD Action. She's collaborated with us over 4 or 5 years now and is an amazing advocate for OCD. So over the course of the 2 hours that we're together, I think we'll have a range of thoughts and experiences that I think will leave us with a lot to take in and absorb, and I think will be a really good evening for all of us. The webinar will last for about 2 hours. Dr. Hallett and Dr. Browning will speak, and then they will be followed by Ria. We'll then have a 10-minute break, and during that break, I particularly encourage you to share your questions, because after the break, there will be a Q&A. You can drop your questions at any stage in the Q&A, which there's like a button at the bottom of the screen there. So for the Q&A, we won't necessarily be able to ask and answer every question that comes in there, but we'll do our best to respond to the questions that are asked most frequently or come up or are most pertinent to the talk. So, you know, you can pop those in on that button there at any stage throughout the question and even during the Q&A. All the panelists this evening have very kindly said they're happy to stay for the Q&A. So you can pop in questions for any member of the panel this evening. We hope everything runs smoothly this evening, but we are on a tech platform. So if you have any technical difficulties, I think the team have just popped an email address in the chat now. So please do email that if you have any difficulties, and we'll do our best to assist and get things back up and running. The other thing I would say is that this session is being recorded. Just to assure you, we can't see you, so none of you are being recorded. So, you know, do make sure that you're comfy and you've got a cup of tea and you're really relaxed. But also to assure you that if, you know, the Amazon person comes with a parcel, or you need to feed your cat or whatever, and you miss a section of this, it is being recorded and you'll be able to come back to it at any stage. Also, you know, bearing in mind that it is being recorded, we'd really encourage you to look after yourself. So if you need to take some time away, or you feel like, you know, finishing the whole webinar this evening is maybe more than is right for you this evening, we really would encourage you to step away, because you will be able to come back to the content. Equally, in the chat, there are services that you can reach out to. You can contact our helpline if you need more support or information following the webinar. There's also information about services that you can contact if you need more immediate support this evening, because the most important thing is that we all each other and ourselves this evening and following the webinar. So I am shortly going to stop speaking, and Dr. Hallett and Dr. Browning will join us. It's my absolute privilege to introduce them both. Perhaps they'd both like to pop on their cameras so you know who will be joining us this evening. So as I said earlier, both Dr. Hallett and Dr. Brownings are from the specialist OCD clinic. They work together there, and we're really privileged that they're joining us. Dr. Hallett is a senior clinical psychologist with a specialist interest in cognitive behavioral therapy for people with OCD. She actually worked for 8 years before she moved into her current role at the specialist Maudsley Centre that treats children and young people with OCD. She's also a peer-reviewed author. And actually, Dr. Brownings has followed a similar career path. He worked with Dr. Hallett also at the specialist centre at the Maudsley. But he has worked both with adults and children, providing specialist OCD treatment. He's also a peer-reviewed author and has delivered teachings across both academic and charity settings. I've had the treat to look at their slides in advance of this evening's sessions. So I can see both how they've really developed some very technical ideas and are able to communicate them well and really thoughtfully. So I am really looking forward to the next kind of 45 minutes or so as they work through this content together. I know that they can't hear us, but if we could just lean in and give them a big round of applause, that would be absolutely wonderful. Welcome, both of you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. That's a really lovely introduction. And yeah, it's so lovely to see so many of you here today. Yeah, we just wanted to say such a big thank you to OCD Action for having us here for this webinar. It feels like a really valuable resource that you're all putting together with this webinar series. So we hope it will be helpful for the people affected by OCD and their families as well. So yeah, really, really happy to be speaking with you all. Jennifer, would it be all right to share the slides? Amazing, thank you so much. And maybe if we move on to the next slide. Thank you, that's brilliant. So yeah, I suppose our aim today is to think with you all about recommended treatments for OCD. I think we're really aware that it can be very daunting trying to work out which treatment to be seeking out and sort of what treatments have the strongest evidence for OCD. So yeah, it can be a really tricky process trying to link in with the right therapy. So I guess we wanted to share with you a little bit about hopefully what good and effective treatment can look like and what the kind of key recommendations are. We're going to be thinking mainly about something called CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. And you might be familiar with this term exposure and response prevention, ERP. And that is sort of something that we think is really important within effective CBT treatment. We'll also be thinking a little bit about CBT with what we call a bit more of a cognitive focus, so a focus in on thoughts and technique to help with really challenging and distressing thoughts in OCD. And we're also going to think with you briefly about medication and recommended medication options. Stuart and I are not psychiatrists, we're psychologists, so we're not able to give detailed medical advice, but we're happy to summarize what the NICE guidelines kind of say about what the most effective medication routes would be, and hopefully that will kind of point you in the right direction. We really want to give you a flavour of what kind of good treatment would involve and what to look out for, but also hopefully to give a hopeful message that I think people will be coming to this webinar at different stages of their treatment journey. Some of you might be kind of seeking out treatment for the first time, maybe. Some of you might have had quite a lot of treatment before and might be feeling quite stuck. So I suppose we're wanting to say that if treatment hasn't been helpful, what could you consider next, and what would next steps be? Because yeah, we want to always know that there's other options available if things so far haven't been helpful. Okay, yeah, so next slide, please, Jennifer. We just wanted to recap really briefly on sort of what we mean by OCD. For a kind of much more detailed summary, I would point you back to the first two webinars in this series, which were sort of covered in brilliant detail. But in short, OCD, as we know, is characterized by what we call obsessions. And these are kind of repeated thoughts or worries that pop into somebody's mind. They can also be images. They can be urges or impulses, and they can sometimes be kind of video clips that play in someone's mind. And they're experienced as intrusive and unwanted, and they can be just incredibly distressing kind of things that kind of come over and over again. And these obsessions trigger generally a very high level of anxiety, but they're also associated with other kind of challenging emotions as well. So often guilt, shame, sadness, disgust. And what we often see is that to relieve that anxiety, or often to try and prevent a feared outcome or that worry coming true, people with OCD often engage in compulsions. And so these are the repetitive behaviors or kind of mental acts that people perform in response to those thoughts that are popping in to try and bring down that level of anxiety. Generally, these are really excessive and sometimes aren't connected in a really clear way to that particular worry. Sometimes that link can be quite difficult to make sense of. It might not seem completely rational. But yeah, these compulsions sort of serve to keep OCD going. And according to our diagnostic manuals, generally we're thinking about diagnosing OCD when these obsessions and compulsions are taking over an hour a day and are beginning to cause really significant levels of impairment and distress in people's lives. So that is typically the stage when people start thinking about hopefully reaching out for some help and thinking about what treatment options might be kind of most effective. Can I move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. Amazing. So today we are going to be thinking about recommendations based on the NICE guidelines. And you may be familiar with these. So NICE stands for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And this is an independent organisation that looks at all of the research that has been done into every different treatment for different health and mental health conditions. And they basically put together a summary of which treatments they think have a kind of clinically important effect for those conditions. And, treatments will only get in there if they have a very solid, robust evidence base. And so when we're looking for kind of therapeutic support, this is a really good place to go to find out what to be looking for. You can Google NICE guidelines for OCD treatment and have a read. They also think about something called a stepped care approach. And this is the idea that, for people are experiencing different levels of severity of OCD. And so the type of recommended treatment is going to differ according to how severe and impairing kind of OCD is for them at the moment. And they tend to recommend starting at the lowest level of intensity of intervention and then gradually working up. If treatment hasn't been helpful, then considering kind of what the next level would be. So we'll also have a think with you about what those different steps might look like kind of going forward if treatment so far hasn't felt helpful. And I should say today, Stuart and I have a background in kind of child and adolescent work. We do work with adults as well. Most of the conversations we'll have today will be about adult treatment, but actually everything that we're going to talk about has kind of really kind of important relevance for children and adolescents as well. There's lots of things that are very, very similar across both, but obviously just we adapt things for kind of developmental stage. Okay, next slide, please.
I think this is where I take over, Tori, isn't it, for to start? Is that right?
It is. Thank you, Stuart. That would be great.
No problem. You have to try and stop me from talking, Tori. You know what I'm like. So hello everybody, and thanks very much for joining, and thanks to Lee for that lovely introduction as well, and thanks Tori for kind of introducing us and starting us off. So as Tori kind of rightly said, we're going to be thinking today about kind of the recommended and efficacious treatments for OCD, and this is the best place to start, if any. So we're going to be thinking about today kind of cognitive behavior therapy, so CBT, which I'm sure many of you have heard about before. And as the diagram shows, that CBT, and so you can have sort of CBT for lots of different difficulties, you know, kind of depression, psychosis, OCD, social anxiety, and lots of other different types of anxiety. But we obviously be thinking about kind of CBT with within the context of OCD today. And in general, kind of CBT thinks about your kind of thoughts and beliefs, so the cognitive part of the kind of title, so that people, you know, in OCD would be intrusive thoughts and beliefs that may be seen to be excessive, as Tori was kind of saying earlier, but I think, you know, intrusive thoughts that are particularly recurrent, distressing, impacting in life, because all of us, and we'll talk about kind of intrusive thoughts a bit later, but you know, all of us experience intrusive thoughts from time to time of varying natures. Sometimes they're pleasurable intrusive thoughts, sometimes they're not so pleasurable intrusive thoughts, but they're quite more to everybody. And obviously within CBT, think about your emotions. Emotions and obviously often come off the back of the thoughts and beliefs we're having. And I suppose within OCD, you can have quite distressing, intrusive and excessive thoughts, which then lead you to feel kind of anxious, which is obviously a huge driver within OCD, and drives some of the behaviours, which is the kind of the bottom circle there, that drives some of the compulsions and rituals that we see, and that Tori and I work with people to try and challenge within OCD. And all of this, and when we feel anxious, and when we feel different emotions, and they often accompanied by different bodily sensations, and that kind of comes up within a kind of fight or flight response we'll talk a little bit about later. So the bodily sensations that are so common, and you know, in anyone who experiences anxiety, you know, myself included, and everyone here will experience anxiety in different forms and to different degrees. But you know, bodily sensations such as, you know, churning stomach, heart racing, you know, kind of feeling very tense, and just, yeah, maybe sweaty, getting red in the face. I know that lots of mine, I kind of have those when I'm feeling anxious. And you'll see that all of these are interconnected: the thoughts, beliefs, emotions, behaviors, and bodily sensations. And all these arrows are double-headed. And so I think what I often, when I'm talking to people about in treatment and sort of doing the kind of psychoeducation phase, which we'll talk about in a minute, I talk about how it isn't always such a linear kind of model of, you have a thought, you feel anxious, then, you know, you get a bodily sensation, then you do like a behavior or a ritual. Sometimes when I feel anxious about something, I notice it first in my shoulders. I think, oh my God, my shoulders are around my ears. Like, why are they kind of up around my ears? And then I realize, oh, because this is coming up and I feel a bit anxious about it. So these all kind of interlink and don't necessarily come in a straight line. So I think that's really important to kind of mention when you're thinking about kind of these different steps, these different things that we experience and we look at within CBT. Okay, next slide, Jennifer. Obviously, Tori, if anything I'm missing or you want to chip in anything, please do feel free to say. So in terms of CBT for OCD, CBT for OCD has sort of different parts, lots of different kind of parts to it. The first part of CBT for OCD is a detailed assessment. And I think the important thing about OCD work, and the important thing from my perspective about kind of OCD work, is the devil is in the detail. It's really important to get lots of detail around kind of how the OCD is presenting, what thoughts or movie clips or images or feelings within the obsessions realm the person is experiencing. And those can sometimes morph and wax and wane over time as well. So it's important to get a sense of if OCD has changed over time to different types of obsessions. Sometimes it's a combination of different obsessions. And yeah, so looking at the history and also looking at the current challenges. How is OCD impacting on your life now, not only in terms of the intrusive thoughts and images and movie clips if you have them, but also what in terms of the rituals, whether they be kind of physical rituals that people have to do, compulsions, mental rituals, which Tori mentioned earlier, in thinking about the kind of diagnostic criteria for OCD, or avoidance, which often can be missed actually within a kind of OCD framework. And I think avoidance is really common within people certainly that I work with OCD, and can often be missed as a type of compulsion. I would very much treat it the same and work with the person the same as I would with physical compulsions or mental compulsions. Really importantly as well within CBT for OCD, you've got to develop goals with the person you're working with, like, because that's the reason they're there. Like, why, if they don't want to get anything out of treatment, why are they there? You know, you'd expect that people want to, you know, the very common goal is obviously to get rid of OCD and reclaim their life from obviously this hugely impactful disorder. And think about just more specific goals. It might be goals they want to achieve in the first few weeks of exposure, or, you know, kind of in 6-7 weeks, or at the end of treatment. What do they want to do? They want to go out more? Do they want to interact with their family more? They might be worried about at the moment because of contamination. Do they want to see their friends more? Do they want to kind of wash their hands less? That, you know, there's lots of different things that people have goals that they develop, and that's really important. It's really important also not to just do that as a box ticking exercise, that you develop those goals but then you constantly review them in treatment. That's really important, because otherwise you know, there's no point in doing them. You need to make sure that you're working towards goals as the work that we're doing. Psychoeducation, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. Oh, sorry, formulation, missed that bit out. Formulation, in terms of looking at kind of populating an OCD cycle, which some or many of you may have seen previously, and thinking about mapping OCD onto the kind of what thoughts, behaviors you're having, what the situation is, what thoughts, behaviors, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and bodily sensations you are having within that kind of OCD maintenance cycle, and what's kind of keeping OCD going, and thinking about where we can kind of break that cycle to start reclaiming your life, as I was saying earlier, because there's often lots of different maintenance cycles that people have within their OCD, and as part of psychoeducation, you think about that with people and map it out for them. And so, yeah, so psychoeducation, certainly with me, and I'm sure, you know, I have a good sense of working with Tori as well, as Lee said earlier. So I know this is a huge part of what Tori does as well. It's really important to kind of learn about OCD, kind of how it works, kind of how it's maintained, where it can be really slippery, and try and sort of sneak through the gaps of kind of ERP tasks if they're not thought and planned out carefully. Looking at kind of where the anxiety is, thinking about just general kind of levels of anxiety as well. You know, as I was saying, everyone experiences anxiety for different reasons. So thinking about kind of fight or flight, and again, we talk about that a little bit in a minute. And also looking at kind of what the thoughts are, and to some extent kind of normalizing intrusive thoughts, but understanding that intrusive thoughts with OCD are often hugely distressing, hugely recurrent, and hugely impactful. And I think it's really important with OCD work. This is such a big part of OCD work, is exposure and response prevention, which is something I predominantly use with the young people and adults I work with. But also for some, cognitive techniques are more appropriate and applicable to them if they're maybe not able to do exposure, find exposure hard, or they're just more suited to kind of cognitive techniques. But it's so important that you actively challenge the OCD. It's not you're not going to sit in a room and talk. I always say to people, this is hard work, but it's work. You come in, you do, you know, we think about the things that person wants to challenge week on week, and the person, from my perspective, is always in charge of that. I don't tell people what to do each week, because they are the experts of their OCD. Obviously, I have experience of OCD, so as a combination, it's perfect, because they know their OCD inside out, unfortunately, because it has such a huge impact on their life. So they know what feels possible to challenge each week. So it's down to them. They kind of run the show, as it were, and I help them create tasks around what they want to challenge. And we do it in session as much as possible. Sometimes exposure work it doesn't always transfer from home. Often OCD is in the home, and with lots of compulsions that kind of happen in the home. Sometimes you can transfer it to the clinic, and I think it's really good sometimes where you have a hybrid model of kind of online and face-to-face work, which is something that I do with lots of people, where you can do face-to-face sessions and online sessions where people are in their homes, and that lends itself well to in-session exposure work, because people are in their homes sort of doing it live, as it were. And then the homework is so important. I can't stress that enough. I really can't, because the magic within kind of exposure work is the practice. Practice. And the more you practice, you know, if I say to people, if you could do this particular thing 1,000 times a day, your anxiety would be, you know, so heavily reduced so quickly. But I appreciate people have lives to lead, but doing this kind of exposure work as homework is so important, and that all of that will help towards kind of keeping OCD away and reclaiming your life back from OCD. Because the thing is, not only, you know, you reclaiming your life back, but also family reclaiming their life back, because OCD tries to get everyone to dance to its tune, unfortunately, family members through accommodation. And that can be not just parents, but kind of siblings, or could be friends, one of work colleagues. You know, OCD will try and get everyone hooked into the compulsions that it wants people to do and wants the person to do. And the big part of the kind of CBT for OCD is the kind of ending sessions, couple of sessions where you do a relapse prevention plan, where you think about, you know, how do we maintain all the progress that you've made in treatment, and then you think about anything that's left to fight, make a plan around that, and think about what you've learned in terms of tools. Because CBT for OCD is not shouldn't be a long-term treatment. It should be something that is you know, certainly weekly sessions of a certain amount, maybe sort of 10, 20, 30, 40, depending on, you know, kind of the difficulties and how quickly people challenge their OCD. But it's certainly not a years and years treatment. You know, it should be something that, if worked hard at and really challenged in a systematic way, people are surprised at how quickly they can make gains and challenge OCD. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So again, this is kind of the big part of the psychoeducation phase of what we do. So we think about kind of what is OCD with people on a more general level, think about causes, and causes were things like, you know, kind of a reduced flow of serotonin in your brain. So it's not kind of I would say like a reduced amount, it's just a kind of reduced flow. And medications, which we'll touch briefly on later, like SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, I think I've got that right. They help the flow of serotonin kind of through your brain. So that's one potential cause of OCD, and all these are potential causes, because I think you know, even we aren't sure of the exact causes, and it could be a combination of some of these things, but other things as well. So it could be a reduced flow of serotonin in the brain. Things like obviously genetics can play a huge part, or a small part, either way, in people experiencing mental health problems. Also, another cause that we think about with people with OCD is evaluating situations as more threatening than they actually might be. So putting a lot of kind of threat within particular situations, which may be day to day, but they experience as particularly threatening. And also a stressful life, having a stressful life. Sometimes OCD can knock on the door when people are feeling very stressed, and kind of say, well, you know, if you do everything really kind of consistently, really rigidly, and don't sway from that, and do these things over and over and over and over and over again, you'll reduce the stress you have in your life. But no one has ever said to me that the compulsions they do reduce their stress. In fact, they very much increase their stress, as far as kind of my experience has been of people working with OCD. We think about the prevalence as well, in terms of kind of about 2% of the population. Tor, is that kind of what we're sort of thinking around that sort of mark? And then thinking about different myths within OCD, you know, because some people think that, you know, they can't get rid of OCD. OCD is kind of there for life. Particularly if they've had treatment before, they might think, oh, you know, it's just not possible for me. I've got a particularly difficult type of OCD that no one else has. And oftentimes we kind of hopefully debunk those myths. And I think one of the biggest things that we can do, particularly in the psychoeducation phase, is give people hope, because there is such hope. It's not false hope at all. If people work really hard in treatment, and there's such a good chance that, you know, they can get rid of OCD and get rid of it for good, and stop it from kind of rearing its ugly head again, and reclaim their life, as we said earlier. And as I mentioned also before, kind of normalizing negative intrusive thoughts. You know, everyone has negative intrusive thoughts. I have the classic one for me is always pushing people in front of a tube whenever I'm kind of on the underground. I had one about sort of throwing my son the other day, who's very young, when I picked him up from nursery. But yeah, just ones that kind of pop into your head really randomly. and that they're kind of unwanted, they're kind of uncontrollable, and certainly thinking that thoughts are not facts. They are just thoughts, just kind of a little bit of electrical impulse in your brain, and, you know, a few words, random words strung together in your head. So that's really important about thinking about intrusive thoughts. And then understanding anxiety. So thinking about the physical sensations that people experience when they're having anxiety. And as I said to you, mine are kind of like stomach churning. I get a bit hot, get a bit sweaty, go a bit red, particularly in this heat as well at the moment. And sort of fight or flight responses, and thinking about how people respond to threat differently. So kind of facing the danger head on, or kind of running away, and thinking about how those physical sensations in subtly different ways help us in that fight or flight response. You know, things like, you know, when you get sweaty, for example, when you feel anxious, that helps you to bring your body temperature down, so you're in the best place possible to either fight that danger head on or run away from it. And then thinking also about anxiety habituation, thinking about times where outside of OCD, with people where they might have done something that initially was quite scary. First day of a job, first day of school, learning a new hobby with people they don't know, and then them going back and doing that thing again and again and again, and actually experiencing that their anxiety goes over time with lots and lots of practice. And then we try and map OCD onto that with lots and lots of practice, so they experience the same reduction of anxiety for the things that cause them anxiety in the first place. And rating anxiety. So lots of kind of rating anxiety as you're going through and fighting OCD, and thinking about how that anxiety is coming down with lots of practice and challenging of OCD. And it's really helpful to get those ratings, whether those ratings come, to think about, you know, so people can identify and experience that actually their anxiety is coming down with lots of fighting. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So this is the OCD cycle that I talked about earlier. The situation would be like kind of touching the toilet door handle in this particular example, and the obsession would be, I might have germs on my hands, I'm going to make someone seriously ill, or myself ill, or I'm just going to feel contaminated, I'm going to have that horrible feeling. Then you kind of have, this is more for the cognitive model, this next bit. When I have that thought, I take it to mean it's true, it's my responsibility, I must kind of avoid kind of touching the toilet door handle, for example. You have emotions that then come from that, like kind of anxiety or guilt, or oftentimes frustration as well. So I'm hoping that people are frustrated when they have to do these compulsions, when they're having kind of going through its OCD cycle, because if they're frustrated, it tells me they want to get rid of this stuff, you know, they want it to get it gone. Whereas if someone says, oh, you know, I think it keeps me safe, and I'm really kind of quite wedded to it, that can be quite hard for that person to shift and challenge that, because it feels particularly risky. And obviously all of this, you know, like ERP, you have to take some risks in kind of to make some gains, but it's about how much risk you feel you can take, and working through that slowly. There are compulsions that attach the kind of anxiety and the trigger and the obsession, a kind of long and frequent hand washes, avoiding touching other people, avoiding touching the toilet door handle, monitoring everything I've touched. You know, some people can almost see it as like a heat map for OCD, where if you almost have the lights off, you could see where people have touched, and people kind of have that in their mind often. They describe it to me as almost like trying to map out where people have touched or they've touched, so they can try and keep some sort of handle on it when the OCD is particularly bad, which obviously is really difficult because you just can't see it, and trying to keep that all in your mind is it's all consuming, really. And those compulsions, they work in the short term, they work. That's why people do them. You know, but they only work in the short term. They give you some temporary relief, but actually in the long term, when this trigger happens again, for example, brushing past the toilet door handle, then you're kind of instantly transported into that same OCD cycle again, and so go round and round until you come into treatment, and we start to break up these cycles. We take out, you know, kind of the bits that are maintaining it, which is often the compulsions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide, Jennifer. So this is the kind of the magic bit within CBT for OCD, and something that makes, for me personally, makes such a huge difference. And when people get really rolling with exposure work and really start to build confidence in it, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing, the progress that people make. And it's so lovely to see. And they initially lots of times they feel quite surprised at the progress they make, but then as soon as they start to feel confident, then the really kind of snowballs in a positive way. The exposure would be sort of facing the fear. Within exposure and response mentioned, it's exposure is facing the fear. So if we take that last example that in terms of the OCD cycle, the exposure would be touching the toilet door handle on purpose. That would be the exposure. That the fear is the door handle because it's contaminated or felt to be contaminated by OCD. So you expose yourself to it by purposefully touching it every time you go to the loo, or actually even when you're not going to the loo, when you're walking past, you put the bathroom, just give it a little rattle with both hands. And then the response prevention is kind of fighting the action. So it's about lots of things in this actually. So the response prevention for this example of like the door handle being contaminated is obviously not doing the things that OCD wants you to. And OCD wants you to avoid the door handle. OCD wants you to wash your hands lots if you think you have brushed past the door handle. So the response prevention bit in this example would be not only kind of facing the fear and touching the toilet door, but then it would be about using your hands normally afterwards and avoid kind of washing your hands afterwards. And just, you know, kind of initially spreading kind of that contamination that OCD says is around, to show you that actually OCD is led by anxiety and not based in kind of any of the worries and obsessions that you know that OCD puts in your head. I think a really important thing to say is that, say for example, if OCD says, oh, you know, if you don't wash your hands, or if you don't avoid touching the toilet door, that you know that you're going to get ill. I think it's really important. The message I give to people in exposure work is, by touching the door handle, not washing your hands excessively afterwards or at all afterwards, I'm not saying that you're never going to get ill, because that is something that all of us experience. All of us get ill from time to time. But I suppose what I'm saying is, in the work you're doing, all the excessive things that OCD is asking you to do by avoiding the door handle totally, washing your hands excessively, that isn't keeping you safe from kind of being ill, because everyone is going to get ill from time to time. But actually, you know, it's just excessive and doesn't make you any less likely to get ill, really. So I think that's a really important point that I often say to people, that it doesn't often make any difference whether you wash your hands loads or not at all. For that particular example, it's just OCD kind of making you feel like you have to. And then you monitoring the anxiety as you're doing the exposure work, as you're touching the toilet door handle and practicing lots and lots and lots, monitoring where your anxiety's at. So you probably will find in the first couple of days where you are maybe touching the door handle loads, you might have that same level of anxiety, but it might go down slightly quicker. And then you might start to find that actually your anxiety starts to drop when you are touching the door handle, to the point where it hopefully will just be a memory of, oh my God, do you remember when I couldn't touch the door handle? But there's no anxiety at all when touching the door handle anymore. And it's kind of, really graded exposure. So as I said, for me personally, the person is always in charge of the work they're doing. So it might be that they touch the door handle first with one finger, then they touch it with 2 or 3 fingers, then they touch it with a whole palm and, all of their hand, and then they touch it with both hands. And then you build it up slowly, and you're guided by the hierarchy that you've collaboratively can't say that word, created with the person, and then they decide how much they push it each week. Some weeks will be harder than others. Some week life will be stressful, so they might not be able to take on so much. Other weeks they might come in and say, right, Stu, let's go for it. We're going to do loads today, and they really kind of push it. But I'm always guided by the person. I always try and give them a little nudge in the right direction as well, if I feel like there is room for kind of increased exposure. But I'm always very keen to let them know they can always tell me that they need to sort of stop it or cut it at a certain point. In session as homework, really, really, really important, as much as you possibly can. In session's helpful because then they get a sense of any questions that might crop up, anything unexpected might crop up. OCD can often, because it's annoyed, you're challenging it, it can often try and throw in a curveball, something that you haven't thought about before. It can often make you try and compensate. So say, for example, if you touch the toilet door, you don't wash your hands afterwards, OCD might think, okay, I'm going to let you have that one, but I'm going to increase another compulsion elsewhere to try and balance the scales. So it's always really important that you think about any compensatory compulsions that might kind of crop up, because you want to try and limit those as much as possible. And I'm always very clear with people that I would want people to, their exposure tasks for homework, those are the things that should improve week on week with lots of practice. The rest of the compulsions that aren't on the homework list yet, but are on the hierarchy, they will stay the same. Okay, let's not just make sure they don't get any worse, because then if you do it like that, as long as you're working through the homework and the homework's going down, eventually it's all going to go down, it's all going to go away. So that's really important to look out for, those curveballs and those compensatory compulsions. Involving parents, carers, partners, siblings are really important, because accommodation of OCD rituals, occurs in sort of 90-95%, maybe more, of family members. So it's really important to get families involved, and those kind of accommodations of OCD, whether it be reassurance seeking, getting other people involved in kind of getting objects for people, helping people with OCD avoid certain situations. It's helpful to get family members in to help think about what can be done slightly differently so OCD doesn't get what it wants, basically, and working ways about how you can do that gently in a stepped, graded way, as we said before. Then reflecting on what you kind of learned week on week, when you come back and think about the homework you've had to do in terms of exposure homework, think about what went well, what was difficult, if you need to kind of adjust exposure work accordingly, increase it, or slightly just take a step out because it's been particularly difficult. I always say to people, worst case scenario, it's good information when you come back and you talk about exposure work. If you haven't done it all week, then that's really good information. That means it's been really hard. Obviously, I would love you to come back and be like, Stu, I absolutely smashed it, which a lot of people do. But it's not always the case because life can get in the way or things can feel particularly difficult. So I think it's just helpful conversation, and it's never about being in trouble for not doing your homework, which some people can feel kind of worried about. And using rewards if people kind of want to, and that can help for really lots of people, and certainly helps with some of the younger people that I work with. But we all like a reward, whether we're children or adults. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Creating a hierarchy is really important. I think it's it's the blueprint for ERP sessions, which ERP sessions probably make up, kind of 80% of the sessions that you have, with a psychologist or CBT sort of therapist. And it should not be rushed. So it's about creating a list of all the things that you want to get rid of for OCD. And as I said, should include all the compulsions to be challenged. And I always do it where I write it with people. They have a copy, I have a copy. It's written as though they're already resisting the kind of OCD. So if, for example, they're washing their hands excessively, we would write it on the hierarchy as not washing hands excessively, because that makes it easier to rate. You don't have to flip it in your mind. You can just say, right, if I want to kind of wash my hands normally as I want to, my family norms, what is the anxiety for that? How anxious am I going to feel to kind of wash my hands normally or not excessively? And if you write it like that, as it's already being resisted, it just makes it easier to resist. And I think all of this work, not just the hierarchy, should be tailored to the individual. We're all individuals. Even if OCD is the same in terms of the obsession, it's not the same because it presents differently in everybody. So I think the hierarchy is the same. It should be tailored to the individual and the individual's difficulties. So as part of that, like, numeric ratings aren't for everyone. People don't always get on with numbers. So I think it's about using different hierarchy ratings that just the person feels most comfortable with. So as I've put here, you can put traffic lights, so red for particularly high anxiety provoking compulsions that would be challenged, then amber and green for the middle and the easier ones to challenge. All this kind of anxiety mountain, which you can use oftentimes in lots of younger people, where you have kind of high, medium or low, or kind of high, middle and low in terms of kind of a mountain. So it's just making sure it's created with the person and for the person. I think that's really, really important. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So this is a hierarchy example, and it's certainly of someone that I've worked with previously. So the example is, obviously all the information has been kind of changed in terms of names, so it's non-identifiable. But this was Seb, and you can see there that there's lots of kind of compulsions that Seb had on his hierarchy, and Seb's kind of obsessional fears were around kind of paedophilic obsessions, so worried about kind of sexually assaulting young people, and also animals as well. So you can see that relates to a lot of the compulsions that are on Seb's hierarchy. So this is what Seb had on his. I would love to say that all of my hierarchies are this neat. If you saw my actual handwriting, you probably wouldn't be able to read it. So this is a neater version of that. But yeah, so you can see they range in difficulties from 10 at the top to 3 at the bottom. Don't always have to have them kind of in order like that. Obviously, if you're particularly organised and you want to, that's fine. But as long as you have the ratings, that's really important. Then you can pick off the ones you want to choose. The person will pick off the ones they want to choose each week. Sometimes it might be one. Sometimes there might be one on the list that is too hard to tackle on its own. And so you almost have like a mini hierarchy underneath. So, for example, like if it was like driving to work via school route, it might be that you can't just do that straight away because 5 out of 10 feels too difficult. So you might drive part of the way via the school route and then sort of then kind of turn off before you do the whole thing, and grade it. Make sure it's graded, as I said before. So it doesn't have to be, just because it's one item on the list doesn't mean you have to do the whole thing in one go, would be my my thought on that. So that's just kind of an example hierarchy that I would have as a blueprint for a lot of the exposure work that we do, all the exposure work we do. Next slide, please, Jennifer. These are some of the example kind of ERP tasks that I had with that I did with Seb. If you can just click through to the end of these, Jennifer, that'd be perfect. Thank you. So yeah, having the dog's head on lap initially for kind of 30 minutes. Thank you, Lee. That's really helpful. I'm going to stop talking soon and hand over to Tori because I feel like I've taken too long already. I'm going to be told off in a minute. So resisting reassurance seeking with Seb's wife, and the wife's response was agreed in the session. How she would respond differently to kind of reassurance seeking as agreed with Seb. So showering with the wife in the house initially, because initially Seb could only shower with his wife in the next door room. So then it was about her being downstairs, then out the house. And then initially kind of grading about getting to a point where he could give his niece and nephew a bath, which he really wanted to do. He really wanted to be like a really present uncle. And it was about kind of grading that, helping them getting ready with the sister first. And then the sister's role was agreed in that about what she would and wouldn't do. And then up to the point where giving niece and nephew a bath and then kind of reading them a story alone in their room, which he was so happy about that he got to do and loved it. And actually went on to have, at the end, towards the end of our work, actually got pregnant with his wife for the first time. And that was something that was being avoided because of the difficulties that he was having in terms of sort of paedophilic obsessions. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So this is kind of the graph you see on the left, the kind of roller coaster type graph, is the anxiety that people experience sort of for treatment. So the anxiety will increase when when a situation comes around in terms of like brushing the toilet door handle, for example. Then the compulsion will immediately be designed and used to bring that anxiety down unnaturally quickly. So it'd be like hand washing, or kind of just avoiding the toilet door generally, or kind of lots of different things, and using anti-bac, asking people, did I brush that toilet door? That will happen constantly. So the anxiety will shoot up because of the situation, and then sort of shoot down when the compulsion is kind of undertaken. Whereas what we want kind of anxiety to look like in exposure and response prevention is that the person touches the door handle on purpose the first time, the toilet door handle, they kind of ride it out, they ride the anxiety out, they don't wash their hands, they don't seek reassurance, they keep repeating that, practice with that, till eventually you kind of get this rainbow effect where eventually the anxiety will be gone for worries around the toilet door handle, with repeated practice of touching it and then not doing the sort of requested compulsions for OCD afterwards. Next slide, please, Jennifer. As I said earlier, I've said lots already, the OCD has a huge impact on everyone around them, and often other people get pulled into doing lots of things for OCD and providing reassurance and objects, helping to people avoid it. Treatment should involve the people that are involved in OCD. It just should, because accommodation is so prevalent in families, and it just makes such a difficult time for in relationships, OCD does. So I think it's so important that it's not just the individual with OCD, because undoubtedly other people will be involved in the OCD rituals that are happening. And sometimes community members, leaders, church leaders might be involved if kind of obsessional worries around kind of religion, then it's helpful to get other people involved to get their kind of thoughts and take on kind of OCD. Obviously, these are people that would know the person and the person has consented to attend the sessions. That can sometimes be helpful. Next slide, please. And overlearning. So overlearning tasks within OCD is kind of the cherry on top, I would say, in terms of CBT and OCD. So you would do the compulsions, you would fight the compulsions using the hierarchy. And it might be that when you've kind of fought all the compulsions in the hierarchy, you think, right, what can I do to really widen that gap between normal life, which I've now achieved, I've reclaimed my life, and OCD trying to rear its ugly head and come back. And there are certain tasks that you can do to really kind of stick it to OCD, as it were, to really kind of increase that buffer between normal life being affected again and really kind of challenging OCD. So these would be things that you wouldn't do in everyday life, but are things that are really kind of just demonstrating, like almost like showing off to OCD, like, this is what you did before, this is what you made me avoid before, but look at me now, look what I can do now in terms of, and if we use that toilet door handle, it might be really kind of touching it, rubbing your face on the door handle, things like that, really kind of saying to OCD, you don't dictate my life anymore, I am dictating my life from now on, thanks very much. If we just go to the next slide, Jennifer, just a couple of pictures, and I'll give you a couple of examples just quickly. So in terms of, these are kind of live examples that I've certainly been involved in, or the clinic that we worked in before, Tori and I have been involved in. So it might be the overlearning tasks, and these aren't for everyone. Not everyone would feel comfortable in doing these, but some people really want to do them to kind of really kick OCD into touch for the kind of last time. So it might be about eating like a sandwich off a toilet. You know, it might be, this is the one in the middle of the kind of bush. There was a young person I worked with who was really worried about kind of leaves, foliage, kind of plants being poisoned by them and insects, and she would avoid historically going out the house because of this, and lived in a very rural area. So she would like roll about in bushes, roll on grass, etc., and do lots of things to kind of expose herself to that kind of thing that she was so worried about previously. And it has such a huge kind of a buoying effect in saying, like, this is just what I can do now, OCD, so you're totally gone. And then the kind of worms and insects one is on a similar kind of theme. So they're kind of only overlearning tasks, which will really kind of help, just to put the final nail in kind of OCD's coffin, as it were. Next slide, please. So I think this is you, Tori. I'm so sorry, Tori, for taking such a long time. You have to let me off. But yeah, so thanks everyone for listening, and I hope I didn't speak too quickly. I'll move to you now, Tori.
Don't worry, Stu. It's really, ERP is just such a huge part of CBT for OCD. So I think it's great to have kind of detail around that. So I suppose what we've thought about so far with ERP is thinking about this idea of trying to drop compulsions and experiencing anxiety beginning to reduce over time. But I suppose that the other sort of strategies that you might come across in CBT treatment are more what we call cognitive strategies. So Jennifer, actually, if you just click on one slide for me, these are strategies that kind of more focus on this part. So this is the interpretation that we make of thoughts that kind of pop into our mind. So in this case, it's this kind of meaning that because I've had that thought, it means it's true. It means it's my responsibility, and it means I have to do something about it. With these strategies, we're just beginning to test that out a little bit more. Is it true? Is it my responsibility? Is there a different way kind of that I could respond in these situations? Can I move the slide on? Thank you. So yeah, one strategy you might come across, I won't go into lots of detail. This is the idea of theory A, theory B. Your therapist might think with you about two alternative ideas about what might be going on for you at the moment. So this is an example of someone we'll call Dan, but for Dan, kind of theory A was that he really strongly believed that his problem was that he was a bad, wicked person who might hurt somebody. And in therapy, we were beginning to think about an alternative to that. So this would be the problem that he would say, my problem is that I am a caring person who worries excessively that I might hurt someone. I pay too much attention to my intrusive thoughts and I struggle to let them go. So in one situation, we're thinking about a real danger problem. And in the other, we're thinking about this being a worry problem. So we often think with people around how much they believe each of those theories at the moment, the evidence that they're using to back up often what is a very, very strong belief in theory A. And we begin to think about what life would look like if theory A was true versus theory B. So for Dan, if theory A was true, we would be encouraging him to keep away from people, not to drive near people, to be, not going near friends and family, maybe talking to the police. But actually, if this was a worry problem, we would be encouraging him to face those fears, to get closer to people, to engage with friends and family, maybe to work with a therapist who could help with those worries. And in therapy, it's about beginning to live a theory B life, even if you don't believe it yet. It's about, can I start to take steps to broaden life, to act as though theory B is true, and to learn some new things about myself. What happens when I live in this new way? Next slide, please, Jennifer. And you may also come across this idea of behaviour experiments in CBT. So this is the idea of deliberately testing out some of those beliefs that OCD is giving you. So for Dan, further on in treatment, it was around deliberately bringing on some of these thoughts and images of harm coming to people, of him causing harm. He did that when he was on his own, when he was walking down the street, and when he was driving his car. And then on one, Jennifer, please. The next step would be making predictions about what he thought would happen. So for example, in stage 1, he was 60% sure he was definitely going to lose control and hurt somebody, and that his anxiety would be 10 out of 10. And then in stage 3, he was 100% sure that he would hurt somebody and that his anxiety would be 10 out of 10. And then click on one for me, please, Jennifer. And actually the next one as well. That would be great. And then we kind of work out, actually, he does this experiment and what actually does happen. The anxiety goes up, not as high as he often thought, and it came down much more quickly than he thought. And actually, he didn't lose control and hurt anybody. And then really drawing out his learning kind of from those tasks. I don't act on my thoughts, even when I'm having them a lot and I'm deliberately bringing them on. Actually, I was anxious, but I was nowhere near losing control. So in CBT, you might spend some time doing lots of different kinds of experiments to test out these worries that have been around for so long. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Sorry, I'm whizzing through slightly. Yes, you might also come across techniques around responsibility. It's so common that in OCD, people feel so responsible for their actions and for harm coming or for bad things happening. OCD can make people think in quite a black and white way. So either I'm 0% responsible or I'm 100% responsible, or good and bad. And sometimes in therapy, it's about learning about this middle ground, actually putting people from your life onto this scale. Where do people fall? Actually, no one is falling at this kind of 100% good or responsible. It's not possible. So yeah, starting to gain some perspective about responsibility, and in a range of different ways. Next slide, please. And then importantly, and these are techniques that I kind of find really helpful, is this idea of learning to unhook and let go of some of these difficult thoughts, and that actually holding on to thoughts and arguing and wrestling with them and rationalizing them and just getting into this debate with OCD can cause so much more damage. And it's about learning skills to be able to step back, to let go, to see them for what they are, to see them as just thoughts. And we sometimes think about almost responding with maybe, maybe not, maybe that thing's going to happen, maybe it's not, but not getting into the argument. And that requires a lot of practice and a lot of thinking, because people understandably have been stuck in these thought patterns and these really, really harsh beliefs about themselves for a really long time. So yeah, it's an important part. Next slide, please. What I might do is I just want to make sure we have time to think about medication. So we might just skip through. If there are questions around stepped care, I think we can come back to that in the question and answer maybe. But if we kind of just step through to the medication slide, if that's all right, Jennifer. Okay, so I suppose what we know in terms of the evidence base for OCD is that there are sort of two approaches that we know have a strong evidence base. There's CBT with ERP, but we also know, particularly for adults, that medication can also be almost equally helpful. Kind of they're comparably effective for adults. And so the types of medications that are most often used are what we call selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. And again, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I will kind of just talk you through those quickly. So often you'll hear about fluoxetine, fluvoxamine, paroxetine, sertraline, and citalopram. And these are, we really encourage you to be discussing these with your GP or with your psychiatrist. The dose of those can be increased, taking into account how well it's working, if there's side effects, sort of what your personal feelings are about medication. But what we do tend to find is that it's higher doses that do tend to be most effective for OCD. So for things like depression, lower doses of SSRIs can be really useful, but often for OCD, people tend to move up slightly higher. And they tend to stay on those medications even after OCD has really reduced down, just to prevent symptoms creeping back in. And holding in mind that, yeah, if you're stopping medication too quickly, missing doses, it can lead to a risk of symptoms creeping back. It's really important to be checking in with someone around side effects and monitoring those. But also that in OCD kind of medication, often you don't see an effect for up to 12 weeks. So it's not sort of an instant effect. You might see effects on things like depression earlier, but for OCD, it's worth kind of waiting and seeing kind of over a slightly longer time period. And actually for young people, similar medications, it's often SSRIs that are kind of sometimes prescribed for OCD, often after CBT has been tried as a sort of first line treatment. And yeah, that would be through a child psychiatrist who would be able to kind of think with you around kind of possible medications for OCD. And can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, and I guess just to finish, before I know we need to hand over to Ria. I suppose our message is, if you haven't found CBT helpful in the past, I wouldn't give up on it completely. I think CBT can look so different according to which therapist you see, according to kind of what particular type of CBT that they're doing. But the things that we've talked about today are helpful things to be looking out for. Be really honest with your therapist if you're not finding it helpful, and hopefully they can collaboratively think with you about changes that could be made. At the moment, according to the NICE guidelines, other therapies don't have enough evidence to say that they are clinically reliable in helping with OCD. That's not to say that you will come across people who may have experienced kind of good outcomes with different kinds of therapies, absolutely. But I suppose this is saying that in terms of the research base and that sort of, yeah, those large scale research studies, CBT is a really important kind of first option, because that is the most evidenced treatment. And just have a think, if treatment isn't working, have a think about other factors that might be playing a role. So have sessions been frequent enough? We often see that for exposure work, dose is really important. It needs to be happening often enough to see changes. Have family been involved if you've got people around you involved in kind of accommodations? Be honest with yourself as well, because often there might be secret compulsions that are creeping in that maybe you haven't acknowledged yourself or kind of shared. There might be mental rituals, it might be reassurance, it might be trying to distract yourself. Yeah, different things that might be kind of making these symptoms keep going. And also be honest around motivation. As Stuart said, it's a hard treatment, and often the timing has to be right. You have to be in the right place and the right time to really go for it. And so, yeah, it might be worth thinking about the timing of kind of seeking this treatment. Yeah, I'm aware we've rattled through it and we've got lots more we could say, but please do, yeah, ask questions after the break, and we'd be really, really happy to think with you a bit more about these treatments.
Thank you both ever so much. That was wonderful and so helpful to have such clear, like, visual examples and actually kind of like felt examples about how CBT and ERP work and how they can work and feel. I think it was just really reassuring and helpful. Thank you both ever so much. And I think we're going to move on now to hear a little bit from Ria, who's a lived experience campaigner and activist and collaborator with OCD. Ria, maybe you want to pop your camera on so people can see you if you want to join, and then we can kind of move on. So it's a pleasure to introduce Ria to everybody. Some of you might have come across Ria. Actually, just to say, just before we move on to introduce Ria, I saw in the Q&A, lots of you were asking if you'll get Dr. Hallett and Dr. Browning's slides, and if obviously when we get to it, you'll get to a note of what Ria said as well. You will. So following this, we put all of these webinars on our website, and so included in that, you'll get to see the slides that have just been shared, and you'll get an email from us when they're live on our website. So we don't always get them up like super quick, not within a couple of days, but this will go live on our website in the not too distant future. So please don't feel you've missed any details if that's been, as we've just kind of gone through a lot of information quite quickly. So back to Ria. It's a pleasure to introduce Ria. Lots of you will know Ria because she's collaborated with OCD Action on lots of occasions previously. She's shared her play, It's a Little Bit OCD, at various OCD Action events, our conference and volunteer thank you events. And then she got her play commissioned and funded by the Arts Council and the National Lottery. And it's played at the Southwark Playhouse and the Cockpit. So she's very well known within the OCD community. She recently recorded, which I was very excited about because I think it was a real inspiring piece of work for the OCD community to really hear their lived experience shared nationally. A piece called The Director of Me on Radio 4, which if you haven't heard, I'd really encourage you to go onto BBC Sounds and listen to, where Ria kind of shared her life over a month, was it, Ria? Yeah, a month or so, and then the editors of the radio kind of cut it down into a half-an-hour program, but it was really insightful and very inspiring. So please, let's just lean in and give Ria a big round of applause, because I'm super excited to be able to ask her kind of 5 or 6 questions over the next sort of 20 minutes or so, just to understand a bit about her journey and her experience of accessing treatment. So if you're ready, Ria, and you've got a glass of water and everything, I'll just ask you our first question that we've agreed. Is that okay?
I'll do my best to be concise.
So can I ask you to share a little with us about how you first found out you had OCD?
Yes. So caveat, I have also found out that I have ADHD as well, some more letters. So I will try and be to the point, but I will probably fail. So do feel free to butt in and direct me back to the question.
Okay.
Yes, I also wanted to quickly say, if that's okay, that I have had OCD a long time and it's severely affected my life. However, my way of sort of coping with it and the way that me and my friends who also have OCD talk about it is quite humorous. We like to attack the power it has over us using comedy. So if I'm talking about quite traumatic things that have happened in my life or with therapy and things in a humorous way, it's not that I don't see the serious side. It's just that is my way of doing the anti-OCD, I guess, which, thank you, Dr. Stewart, that was very helpful. So on that note, I will start. Yes, so I've had OCD since I was 5, roughly. That is around the time I can recognise this cycle pattern. I found out I had OCD by accident because when I was at college, I'm an actor sometimes, and when I was doing a college A-level performing arts BTEC, we decided to do an edgy play about mental health, which was based on a circus, and each act would be a different mental health issue. At this time, genuinely thought I was quite healthy, which is funny to think back to. So I was given OCD to look into, and my perception of OCD at the time was very much the misconceptions that we all see, that I'm sure I don't need to tell all of you about. Washing hands, tidying up, collecting things, that kind of thing, touching things, which can obviously be a big part of OCD, but not the whole story. So I started looking at Wikipedia, a reliable source for all college projects, and actually was surprised to see the kind of inclusion of sexually deviant intrusive thoughts, violent intrusive thoughts, with some examples. And at the time, I was having a lot of intrusive thoughts. It was more kind of what we would call like puro. I know people have different feelings about that word, but like feelings of either harming someone, similar to the example you saw, paedophilic thoughts, like just discriminatory and abusive thoughts. So that was the first time that I'd seen that as an example on OCD. And then I went back to college and made a stereotypical piece about OCD and organizing shoes. But yeah.
Unmute myself. So it sounds like almost in the same way that lots of people that maybe talk to OCD Action through our helpline, or kind of maybe discover that they have OCD themselves through kind of doing some research or coming across something, but actually the kind of world's view of OCD was very different from what you learn and what your experience of OCD. So kind of some of those stereotypes were quite different from that. When you started looking into that, I know we've talked about this, but was kind of it. What was your next step? Did you kind of think about getting a diagnosis? Was diagnosis important to you? What was your next step at that stage?
Well, I think, like, I'm 29, and so this was when I was 17, so 12 years ago. We had never learned about mental health at school. Well-being, nothing like that was on the curriculum. We didn't have any information on that. So I had the kind of, ironically, all of my close friends mostly have now been diagnosed, with neurodivergencies and or mental health issues. So we would kind of disclose to each other, but I didn't really do anything else. And I think, again, it was a different awareness societally wise. But when I did raise it to a few people, it was very much like, no, you don't. And I did also present with some of the more known ones. So like at the same time as that, I used to work in a kitchen and I'd wash my hands until they were bleeding, or like would ritualistically wash things in the kitchen to do a raw meat and stuff like that. So there was quite a lot of examples, but I just think it just wasn't picked up on. So then I kind of just was like, oh, to be honest, I was just relieved that I wasn't like a quote unquote psychopathic killer or child molester, like that was the kind of relief. And then I just left it at that. And continue to do my compulsions for a bit.
Yeah, it sounds like lonely actually in some ways, and really difficult. What happened? When did somebody start to give you like support or treatment? At what stage in your journey did that happen?
So I went to university when I was 22. So I went to drama school first, then I went to another drama school that was attached to a uni. And I went to see someone who I basically at this point had thought that I'd cured myself, because I was getting a lot of hyper responsibility thoughts. And I like always joke about the fact that I feel like if like OCD themes are a bingo card, like I'm Full House. I've done light switches, doorknobs, washed my hands, had loads of mental intrusive thoughts, a lot of harm, all these different things. So at this point, it was like I was being a good person. I'm just a good person, and it kind of came about the same time as cancel culture coming up. And I went to a liberal arts college, so I was much more exposed to people who were a lot more aware on things. And I think just genuinely as a culture, we've come a long way in terms of like public consciousness. So I thought I was just being a good person. So I went to therapy to prevent a relapse, but I was very mentally ill at that time. But even then, yeah, with the mental health help I received, it was like I was going in with a lot of I won't go into now, but like other trauma, and it was all a big ball. Do you know what I mean? So OCD was in there, like probably generalized anxiety disorder. There's been mix of complex PTSD has been thrown about a bit, ADHD that we now know about. I was just kind of turning up a ball of energy, and people were like, oh, we have 6 sessions, you know. So yeah, it wasn't kind of, I've never been in a position that someone was like, I think you have OCD, you should go and get help. Apart from that, I spoke to you about before, when I went to university, and I had those kind of 6 sessions that were based on like well-being and improvement, and they did recommend, they were like, we think you need to go to a mental health service. This is like a lot of, and I'm sure people can relate, when you've never spoke about things, suddenly you open it and it all comes out. And then at the time, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place, at the time of going through these kind of more structured university well-being services, I was then diagnosed with GAD at the like council, the Essex Council kind of, we would have the Brighton and Hove Wellbeing Service, but in Essex. And yes, so that, I don't know if I also had GAD, but I at the time was having these intrusive thoughts I didn't recognize and didn't notice them to be OCD. So when I did the form, that was like the OCI, which some people might be aware of, I wasn't scoring high enough to get diagnosed because I wasn't able to kind of translate the form. So it would be like, do you check the door? And I'd be like, no. But actually I do check whether I've offended someone 800 times, you know, or like, are you thinking negative thoughts? Mm-hmm. And I was feeling like thinking a lot of thoughts that were distressing me, but compared to like, I'm a paedophile or I'm gonna, you know, stab my mum, they weren't distressing on the same level. So I was like, no, you know, everything was, I at this point had been living with OCD for close on 20 years, so my level of normal was quite high. So yes, but I did go through for GAD, the theory A, theory B. I managed to level out that kind of anxiety through that, which was really helpful, and challenge some of the hyper responsibility elements. And then I did another show about mental health, and one of the characters had OCD. And I was speaking to my friend who wrote the show, and I was like, oh, I have OCD. Well, I think I have OCD, I probably said at that time. But I don't have it anymore because I cured myself magically. And then later on, I was talking to her about comedy, and I was at, you know, a theatre devising course. There's a lot of satire and young people trying to make political, you know, challenging, provocative material, and I would very often be triggered. And I sort of said, like, I can't watch a lot of comedians. I don't really like to watch films. If I hear something I don't like, I have to tell people I don't find it funny, because else I feel like I said it and then they will think that I'm responsible for this other person's opinion. And then she just was like, casually, sounds like OCD. And I was like, oh God, it's been here the whole time. Like, it's just, yeah. So that happened in second year, and then I went to go and get help. Graduated.
And what happened at that stage? At that stage, what was the treatment that you received at that stage?
When I got help, yeah, so I moved back to Brighton. I realised we're not all in Brighton when I gave that very specific example of the Brighton and Hove Wellbeing Service. And I got diagnosed, referred to the OCD clinic. And I sort of just said to the lady, I just, which again, I'm sure people can relate to, I was like, I have OCD. Everyone's telling me I don't have OCD. At this point, I'd already written that whole show. I'm just a little bit OCD. I've worked with people who have OCD. Like the actors in it had OCD. I was like, I can't get treatment for OCD because this form and a few of the forms are not like correlating to me, but like I just know I've done all this research, you know, I've written a play, and then she was like, okay. And we went through the form and she translated it to me. And I think, like, I'm going to give some unmedical advice here, so doctors, please cut in if I'm saying something wrong. But that's why for me, the key for now and then and my recovery is to see the cycle, not always the examples, because the cycle is the same. And that cycle may be, you know, at this point, it's got 20 years to ingrain itself into my personality and find what works and ways it can, you know, kind of invest itself in my thoughts and beliefs. It's not necessarily going to be one of the 40 questions. And also kind of an awareness came through the other therapy I had that was helpful, but not specifically OCD, about what like a quote unquote normal level of anxiety was.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So although that first treatment wasn't necessarily CBT and ERP, it didn't necessarily treat your OCD, it did raise your awareness about anxiety and your level of anxiety.
Yeah, and it helped with like different other parts of trauma, which then ended up separating. So I could say, okay, this is OCD, this might be a separate thing, you know.
Yeah, what is and with the treatment that you then got in Brighton with the OCD team, was that CBT and ERP, and what was your experience of that?
Yes, it was, and I was really excited because I was like, finally. And it was very helpful in terms of learning more about OCD and learning about OCD from a doctor and not me Googling things for my own show. That was great. It was a group setting, which was really nice in terms of supporting each other. But for me, at this point, my kind of like theme was moral scrupulosity, which is like basically the way I think about it is like an obsession with ethics. If anyone's in a good place, I'm not saying he has OCD, it's very cheedy vibes. Like, is this right? Is this right? I've got to do the right thing, you know, all the time. I'm feeling very responsible. So the in-person ERP that Dr. Stewart was talking about being very vital wasn't working for me because I didn't feel responsible. I was like, you're telling me to do it, so I'm doing it. So things that if I'd have done myself at home unprompted would have been a 10 out of 10, were like a 1 out of 10. And I was just getting frustrated because I was trying to get anxious, which is what I was seemingly at every other moment in my life apart from then. It was like almost like, you know, when you try and fall asleep and then you're like, go to sleep now. That kind of thing. So they gave me some homeworks to do, which I could then do in my own time. We came up with some kind of creative ways. So I had a friend who would send me the most offensive memes she could find on the internet, but at any time throughout the day. So I wouldn't know they were coming. And I had to know that I was asking her to send them to me. And then I'd have to just stare at them. So we kind of came up with ways like that, and that was helping and that was lowering it. And then it got to March 2020.
Pandemic.
And my theme switched to responsibility and ethics to do with COVID, which I'm sure we can all appreciate. Oh God, like it was like the whole world became an OCD, I don't want to say playground because it wasn't good, but like do you know, like the world from my head.
Really impactful. Like posters, wash your hands, save a life. If you break, like literally can always recite them. You have to wash your hands in this for a certain amount of time with these pictures doing all these positions. If you break a rule, you cost a life. That was one of my favorite bus stops. So that had a big impact on you in terms of your treatment and your journey.
Oh yeah. At this point I could watch Frankie Boyle, fantastic, but I could not go outside. And people I knew who didn't have OCD were acting, in my opinion, like they did have OCD, like washing their food. You know, I googled can licking a stamp give you COVID, and there was hundreds of articles, you know, of people actually, like legitimate media sources going into these. So it was very difficult to work out what was being responsible and what was OCD. And we did a lot of work on following the rules, and that's it. No overrules, you know, no. But then I became obsessed with reading the rules every day.
And I think lots of people listening will really understand that. And really relate to that. And I think it would have had a huge impact on lots of people that are watching this. What did that mean for you in terms of your impact, and what happened to you in terms of the treatment and the next steps along your journey?
So we then started having one-to-one therapy, which was helpful because I felt like in the group setting for me, there wasn't enough time for me to explain these kind of intricacies. Mm-hmm. It was very much like, we're going to all become anxious doing something from a hierarchy, and then we're all going to sit there. So that was really beneficial. It was hard because I could have a special talent, and I'm sure other people can relate to being able to wheedle out of ERP sometimes with things that sound like genuine reasons, and they were at that time. It was, and I think, all doctors and the therapists I was working with were very honest about, this is unprecedented times for us. Things that we'd normally say, you're worried about germs, go out, do this, do that, you couldn't do. So that was quite difficult. But we worked together on different things in terms of like the following just the rules, working on that. But yeah, to be honest, it was very difficult because I think the hierarchy everything was overexposing. So rather than building confidence, I was just overexposing myself, becoming overwhelmed and losing confidence. And that was, not to the fault of anyone. It was just like you were saying, you've got to be in the right time. And I was just absolutely terrified of doing anything. And I think also like a lot of reassurance came, because if I said to someone a few years ago, I have to, and this is a legitimate thing I did, apologize to the moon because I said it looked weird and the moon controls the tide and there might be a tsunami, they'll be like, okay, that's weird. Whereas if I'm like, I don't want to go outside because this person has a cold and they haven't tested and and they were like, oh yeah, that does sound quite, giving a lot of reassurance. And I think I was just always sort of 6 months behind there in terms of like following the rules. So yes, that happened, and I did gradually get it down, but not to a level where I was able to function. I had to leave work like a lot of people, and it was the time when I think I started thinking about going on medication. So I then went on sertraline.
And and I think Dr. Browning and Dr. Hallett kind of really talked about the importance of timing in terms of treatment. So it sounded like that had some impact, but wasn't quite like the right time for you. What was the next step for you? And I'm just thinking we've probably got a couple of minutes left. What was the next step in your journey?
Yes, I do want to end on a positive because this all sounding quite negative. Right, so that was helpful to a level. Then I was very lucky enough to talk to my dad, who agreed to help me pay for some sessions with no OCD because it was online. If anyone can look into it, I would recommend it as well, because I think within a week I had an appointment, whereas obviously with the NHS it was a long wait. It was one-on-one. It was very much looking at the point of my OCD was the same, COVID or Frankie Boyle. It was, I am responsible for doing the right thing and not causing harm and not being involved in something bad, whether or not that's COVID or Frankie Boyle. So we just kind of tackled the root in other ways that weren't COVID related, and then it impacted that. And that was really, really helpful. That we would do a diary so we could do different things like that. He would get me to think of my own ERPs as well, so that therefore I'm responsible for them. It was very useful to kind of there's like an app that comes with it as well. So if an ERP isn't working, rather than having to wait a week in between, you could message them and they could feed back to you. So that was quite reassuring. And that got me to the point where I went from being like not seeing my family, not touching anyone, to the week after the social distancing rule became something that we could choose whether we did. I actually ended up doing a show, Dracula, which I'd practiced socially distanced, and then I had my neck bit. I had to do my first stage kiss. Let me tell you, I was not scared about kissing this guy. because I was just scared about COVID. But I was able to do that from ERP, which is, you know,
Amazing.
absolutely unthinkable. That helped to another amount. So we're now here. But the COVID rules, as they were relaxing, I was sticking to this like rule thing. So I was becoming sort of obsessed with safeguarding children, rules at work, risk assessments. I run a theatre company, so I am in charge of these things. Don't know if anyone works with children, but the safeguarding rule is think the unthinkable. If you see a bruise, is it a bruise or is this person being, and if you don't say anything, here's a load of case study, you know, all this then became the same thing as the COVID. So I was here, but I still wasn't able to go to work. I was reading all the terms and conditions before clicking the box. It was still clearly an issue. But again, we've come here. So this is good. The sertraline really helped with my mood, motivation. It made the spike kind of rounded, I would say. So it was still there, but it wasn't like the world's ending. Nothing's going to be the same again. It was just like, ah. And then I got help with the NHS again. And that time, I've now learnt today, thanks to you, I did more of a cognitive approach. I didn't actually know that word before. So rather than doing the compulsive, like tackling it at the compulsive level of bringing on a trigger and then not doing the behavior, we started looking at the meaning. We started looking at other kinds of compulsions that I hadn't thought about, like self-punishment, for example. Like, if I get COVID and I'm at work, it's fine because I had to go to work. But I'm not going to go to a nightclub because I don't need to go to a nightclub. And if I get COVID at a nightclub, then it's my fault. Challenging these kind of, all those things we just spoke about, the responsibility, how much of it is my responsibility, how much of it is this person's responsibility, how much is it this person's responsibility, the black and white thinking. A lot of the exposures I had to do in terms of morals were like reading petitions and then not signing them. Yeah. Because in my mind, that would be, I read it and now this bad thing's happened because I didn't sign it. Black and white thinking. You know, looking at all those kind of elements, and then in the session, and then the informal ERP, which is like just ERP that's coming about your day-to-day life, you know, your nan's got a cough, is it COVID, has she tested, like that kind of thing. Then I'd be able to put in practice the ERP that I knew. So I was able to do both like that. And then, sorry, I'm very conscious of time, but I just don't want to end on
it sounds like that that really worked for you, that last.
Yeah, but I think each one did. I think if I'd have done 3 without 1 and 2, I don't know,
it might not. So it was, so from your experience, it was needing to go through 3 treatment rounds with different therapists and different techniques and different timing, it sounds like, as well.
Yeah, I think so. And also just knowing what is that, because I just knew obviously, yes, we talk about OCD and we talk about ADHD, but we just have one brain.
Yeah.
So those different things were able to, like, I would have panic attacks if people shouted. Now, to me, I was like, well, that's OCD. No, that's a trauma response. That's something different, you know.
So
I was able to realize that and then have talking therapy to deal with that, but know that wasn't this. Yeah. And just really, now, I just want to say really quickly, if that's okay.
Yeah, one last thing, and then we'll tie it up. Yeah.
I just want to give a positive. So now, I couldn't work for a year. It was bad. It was not good. I've had this for 20 years, honestly. I genuinely now have days that I forget I have OCD. Like, I actually forget. I wouldn't say it's gone. Like, I do that anti-OCD thing all the time. And, you know, it is a thing that I'm aware of could creep in, and it's not like I'm forgetting about it. But those 3 things, and I was someone who thought ERP didn't work for me because in that traditional circle it didn't. But yeah, no, I am a lot better. I'm working, you know, I can write a risk assessment. I don't know what else to say. Something positive.
Yeah, well, you've been on national radio, and you're an singer, and that is such a hopeful end to, I think, what you've just been so gracious.
So hard to be quick, isn't it? Like, here's my life.
It's really hard to be quick because you've been so gracious in sharing what I think has been a really painful journey, and but I think it is so inspiring to hear where you have got to, and thank you for sharing that with us. And you're going to stay for the Q&A at the end, well, in 5 minutes. So what we'll do is we will just take a break for very quickly for 4 or 5 minutes, and we'll come back together at 20 to 9. We have lots of questions in. Just before we get into the Q&A, which we have lots of, there have been quite a few questions on 2 topics, which is about whether or not we can recommend like online therapists or particular therapists. We can't do that, and none of the panelists can do that. There is advice online at OCD Action about finding a therapist if that's what you would like to do, and obviously, you know, you can search people that are speaking if you're particularly interested in finding out about them, and other speakers that have spoken in our webinar series, but we can't recommend specific therapists. And the other questions about is about medication, and again, we can't get into, because nobody here is a psychiatrist, we can't get into answering questions about medication. Again, there are fact sheets on OCD Action's website about medication, and if you'd like to speak to our helpline, again, we can't give medication advice, but they can maybe help you find out about where to go and get information about medication. Okay, so that's enough from me. I will let the experts give answers to their questions. So the first question that came in is, what would you suggest as useful preparation for CBT? So I suspect everybody could answer this question, but perhaps first of all, I might ask Dr. Brownings and Dr. Hallett if they might answer, maybe both of you, and then Ria, maybe you might answer as well following that.
Tori, do you want me to start off, or do you have something you want to say particularly, or?
You go for it, Stuart, and I can chip in.
So what is good preparation for CBT, Lee? Is that right?
Yeah.
So I think from my perspective, obviously, Tori, you will have your perspective on this, but I think from my perspective, like good preparation for kind of CBT is just having some, I suppose, if you want to do some reading around kind of OCD, that's never going to be a bad thing. I think, you know, you can have a look at online if you want to. And I think, you know, you were saying, Ria, that you've done some research in terms of OCD for things that you were doing, and maybe for yourself as well, I think. But as always, you've got to be careful about not doing that kind of in a compulsive way or an excessive way. I think kind of arming yourself with some knowledge is never a bad thing from reputable sources, and I think that's an important thing to do. And I suppose, but also in terms of CBT and ERP for OCD, I think coming with a kind of an open mind, a kind of readiness to engage in the challenging OCD, and a want to kind of make a huge difference to your life in terms of getting rid of OCD, and being ready and feeling ready to be honest about kind of where you're at and kind of how things are going, and kind of being honest each week, I think. And that's one of the best things you can do, is just kind of, you know that it's going to be hard work, but know that, you know, for lots of people, you have the opportunity to give yourself your life back, which most people don't have that opportunity, and you have it in your hands, which is an amazing thing to have. And, you know, I think just some of those things is probably would be my advice in terms of getting yourself ready for CBT. But Tori and Ria, you might have other things you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with that, Stu. And I think it's also knowing that you don't have to wait until you're with a kind of CBT therapist to be taking some of these steps. And I know we didn't talk too much about stepped care, but actually the first step often that's recommended is sort of self-help, and is reading kind of some of the books that I'm sure OCD Action can direct you to. But you know, beginning to do some of these exposures independently, getting a feel for what that feels like, and just really kind of learning about kind of what CBT would look like. But yeah, it's never too soon to get started, really, with kind of trying some of those things out. Ria, I don't know if there's anything kind of you did to prepare that felt useful for you.
I think I can talk on hindsight what I wish I did. And I'm going to bullet points so I stick to time. I would say big one is self-compassion. It's not always going to go really well. It's really easy to bring in my opinion, the perfectionist style to OCD and the black and white thinking. You know, for example, I was like, what, so I can never sign a petition again? And they were like, well, no, but maybe not until you think that your signature is the thing that saved that person. You know, it's a balance. So self-compassion is one. And I would say also educating or getting those people to become educated with you. Because I think what you said about having family and friends involved is fantastic. For me, and it might be different, in the NHS for adult care, there wasn't an opportunity to bring in family and friends. So that kind of was on me to do in terms of educating, but just getting people aware, especially if they're big reassurers, so that you're not undoing all the amazing work you do in a session as soon as you get home by talking about your day. So self-compassion, I would say, you know, giving yourself a break if it doesn't always go perfectly, and letting everyone around you know if you're comfortable, what you're going in for, and maybe what you don't want them to say.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then just following up, Dr. Hallett, from what you were saying, there were quite a lot of questions about CBT and ERP and whether that always needs to be done with a professional. So you just touched on that. Is there anything more? Because there were a lot of people saying, or whether you can do it alone or maybe start that while you're waiting for treatment. I think you started to speak a bit on that. Is there anything more you could speak on to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I suppose it depends on partly on the impact that OCD is having for you at the moment and the severity of the symptoms you're experiencing. So I think if OCD is sort of in early stages, or if it's milder, that sort of what the NICE guidelines recommends is sort of self-help and kind of getting started with some of these kind of techniques independently. You could still have a chat with your GP, but that sort of might be what's recommended. But I think if you are finding that OCD is having kind of a really significant impact, interference in your life, and is occupying a lot of your day, and that it's just feeling really overwhelming to know where to start with that, and it is just, I think, Ria, as you were saying, sometimes it just feels completely overwhelming to take a step forward, then yeah, it might be a good idea to start that with kind of a professional that can support you through it. So yeah, I think I would see how it's feeling for you, and if it is feeling too difficult to take those steps independently, then yeah, reach out for some support.
Brilliant, that's really helpful. Dr. Brownings, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, the thing I wanted to say was just, and really bearing in mind that if you are going to kind of engage in more of a self-help approach initially, as is kind of recommended, I think that if you do kind of start to challenge OCD via self-help, it's always important to do it in a kind of graded way. Just pick one thing that you think is possible to repeat and practice over and over again, because I think oftentimes it can feel so overwhelming that people might dip their toe in the water in terms of challenging something, but then because it feels anxiety provoking at first, when they first start to practice it, that challenge, they kind of take a step back, and it almost like protects that kind of OCD compulsion. So I suppose it's really important that when you do start to make those steps, it doesn't matter if it's kind of even like a small step, because you're still going in the right direction if you do something really consistently. So that's a really good thing to think about first, is what you're going to choose to kind of tackle. And as Ria was saying, being compassionate to yourself, actually the rest of the OCD might stay the same, you know, like, and just and make sure you kind of do it that way, I'd say, if you want to go down that road, which I think is really, can be really helpful and really confidence building as well.
That's really helpful. And I know Dr. Brownings and Dr. Hallett, in your presentation, you were going to maybe speak a bit about stepped care. I wonder if that's something, this might be just a good point just to really like touch on slightly, because kind of moving from self-help onwards sort of feels like a good point just to cover that. Yeah,
absolutely. So I suppose if we're thinking about somebody maybe who's experiencing kind of mild OCD, that the steps would start with self-help. It might then, if that hasn't been effective, would move on to hopefully being offered a slightly more intensive version of CBT. It might be in a group. It might then move on to being offered maybe one-to-one CBT if people felt that was needed. And if that still wasn't helpful after kind of face-to-face, one-to-one kind of CBT, then kind of thinking about adding in medication is often sort of a next step. If someone is presenting kind of with more moderate, kind of more impairing levels of OCD, what the NICE guidelines is recommending is that you're offered either medication or one-to-one CBT. So we know that both of those things are almost equally effective separately, so they sort of could let you choose which one of those you kind of want to pursue. If OCD then is at a really severe level, or if treatments haven't been effective, it's generally a combination of the CBT with ERP and medication together that would be recommended. And then, I know that some people kind of joining us today might be experiencing really, really significant kind of long-standing kind of levels of OCD, and sometimes then kind of thinking with your GP and if you're with a mental health service, they might be thinking about more intensive home-based options, for some people even inpatient options, but there are then sort of more intensive options down the road if other treatments haven't worked. But there is sort of quite a nice, just as you were saying, Stuart, it's all graded, isn't it, of kind of working up and finding the level that is the least intrusive for you. Ultimately, we want you to have the most effective outcome with the least restrictive intervention that can be offered. So that's sort of the pathway.
I think that's really helpful, and it also speaks to it kind of a bit of your experience as well, Rhea, doesn't it? Like that, it can be stepped up, and it can change your treatment over time, and that can be really helpful. So there were quite a few questions about kind of really speaking to treatment and how it works. There were quite a few people asking about what CBT and ERP might look like for Pure O, and whether you're able to speak to that at all.
Yeah. Oh, Stuart, shall I?
Yeah, do you want to start? I can add.
Go. It's a really good question, and it's something we speak with lots of people about. And I do think ERP can be a really kind of effective, helpful approach for people experiencing Pure O. I think generally what the exposure involves is facing those obsessional worries head on. So Pure O, for anyone that maybe hasn't heard of that, is sort of there's a real prominence of the really distressing, intrusive thoughts, and maybe less kind of really overt, obvious physical kind of compulsions that somebody is doing. I guess often what we find in treatment is that when we get into it, there are things that somebody is doing in response to those horrendous thoughts that they're getting. So they might be trying to push them away. They might be trying to neutralize them with some sort of mental ritual. They might be just avoiding anything that would potentially trigger those thoughts. And actually in treatment, we can do things that expose to those awful thoughts. Sometimes that might be imaginal exposure, so we're deliberately bringing on some of those thoughts. We might be writing them down in detail. It's about sort of making room for them and sitting with them and not pushing them away, which is kind of what understandably people kind of want to do. And also some of those techniques we talked about with learning to let thoughts go, of just being able to let those thoughts come into your mind, not grab onto them, not be appalled and horrified by them, but just kind of compassionately letting them go. So we do lots of sort of practice. So it is ERP. It might look a little bit different to what we would do with contamination, but it's still facing fears, and it's still learning to sit with big, difficult emotions in the room. So yeah, I would certainly say ERP could be adapted for Pure O.
That's really helpful. Was there anything you wanted to add, Dr. Brown?
I can't add anything to that. It's perfect.
Rhea, I saw you kind of smiling as Dr. Hallett was speaking. Was there something you kind of particularly resonated with or wanted to speak to on that? You don't have to. I just thought I'd check.
Oh, yeah, I just also wanted to say the different levels, like you were saying, the gradings. I don't want anyone to think because I didn't find all of them helpful or completely helpful in terms of solving it wouldn't help others. That's probably compulsive. Probably shouldn't have said that, but here we are. Yes, I was just thinking though, because I think it works both ways, like you were saying, with the compulsive elements. A lot of people with physical compulsions, once they get rid of them, I'm speaking from my own experience, realize there's also the mental compulsions, the mental rumination and the solving of the problem and the going over it and reviewing. So it's so interesting to hear you talking about just that, because it makes it kind of is also relevant for everyone, is all I was thinking.
That's a really helpful reflection, I think. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. A few people were asking, and I don't know if if anybody feels able to speak to this, and not a problem if not, but about whether CBT can be adjusted for somebody with an autistic spectrum disorder who also has OCD, and whether anybody's happy to speak to that question.
Absolutely. And actually in the kind of NHS clinic where we worked, up to sort of 50-60% of young people we were working with have both OCD and ASD. So it's really, really common that those challenges can go hand in hand, and that absolutely CBT has been shown that it can be really helpful for sort of young people with neurodevelopmental sort of difficulties. I think it's really important that CBT is adapted really thoughtfully for that group of young people, that often treatment is extended. We find that sometimes psychoeducation can just take a little bit longer, that we try and adapt the tools we're using to be really visual and structured and predictable. But actually, I suppose from my experience, actually autistic young people can respond really well to CBT because it is quite structured and rule-based, and you're learning kind of really clear things, and it sometimes almost once that sort of belief you're targeting thoughts aren't facts, and once some young people have learned that, it can be really helpful. It's like they've learned a new rule for kind of working with their OCD. So certainly kind of adults and young people with kind of neurodevelopmental challenges can certainly benefit from a CBT approach.
Brilliant, thank you. Anything you wanted to add, Dr. Rose?
Yeah, I think it just reiterating that point that, as we were saying in the slides, that CBT needs to be tailored to the individual. And it might be the individual has a diagnosis of ASC as well. It might be they have other challenges, but it just needs to be tailored to the individual. So I think it's not a one size fits all. It can look different with different people, and you can do things creatively. It doesn't have to always be written down. Can be more verbal. Can be on a whiteboard. Can be, there's so many things you can do. Different things you might add in, as Tori was saying, in terms of psychoeducation, because people struggle. Or it's just everyone has different strengths and challenges, and so the person you're working with needs to adapt to that, and rightly so, because that's the person that's with them and working with them. So I can't reiterate that strongly enough, really.
And actually, I feel like that is a really good point to end on, because that is, I think, one of the really important messages, isn't it? Is that CBT and ERP can work, and it should be adapted to you and your needs. And you were all ended your presentations with such a hopeful message about working, and do try, if your first treatment, maybe try a different approach, because it maybe can work. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to you all for giving up 2 hours of your evening on, I think, what's now the hottest day of the year, and thank you to everybody that's listened this evening, because we hugely appreciate your engagement as well. So I'm looking at the bottom of the screen because that's where participants are, because we hugely appreciate you listening. If anybody needs any more support, do contact our helpline. We also provide navigating services groups as well, which can help you think about how to access treatment within the NHS. And we also have a conference coming up at the start of October as well, which might be another opportunity to find a bit more support with accessing treatment. So thank you all a huge amount for joining us this evening, and we'll be here again on the 17th of October for our next webinar. Thank you ever so much, everybody. Take care.